Now that we got if statements and error handling out of the way, it's time to move on to repeated code, which we'll implement with a feature called loops. Now, for that, I renamed the control structures Go file into conditionals.go and moved it into a conditionals folder, gave it the conditionals package, and I added the brand new, pretty empty, pretty basic loops Go file in which will work. Now, the great thing is that I got a little demo example project in mind for diving into loops and diving into repeated code, and we can prepare this project together because whilst preparing it, we can practice what we learned over the last course lectures, so that should be a good thing. Because I have a program in mind, a simple demo program, where we can practice different kinds of repeated code, where we will prompt the user for a choice. Our program will be able to perform a couple of different operations, add up numbers, build the factorial of numbers, and so on. And therefore, we want to prompt the user for a choice and then execute different kinds of code based on the choice that was made. And then as a next step, we'll implement loops to perform the actual operations our program should perform. Now, to get started, I will first of all define a global reader variable, a global because I want to use it in different parts of this program, in different functions. And we'll use the buff.io package for that, import it, and create a new reader as we did it before already. And then, of course, use the OS package and reach out to standard in. Now, in the main package, I then want to prompt the user for some input to make a choice about which program or which part of this program should be executed. And for that, I'll add a helper function, get user choice could be the function name, where I first of all will use the format package, which of course therefore also needs to be imported, where we then output some message like, please make your choice. And then I'll first of all present the user with a couple of options. So I'll print another message in a complete line where I say the first choice, for which the user then should press the 1 key on his or her keyboard, is to add up all the numbers up to number x. And the user should be able to choose that number x then, if he or she makes that choice, and then we'll build the sum from 0 up to that number. Now I'll then copy that because my second option, which I want to present to the user, is to build the factorial up to number x, so that if we enter 5, we would return the result of 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. The third mini program that I want to implement in this program, and therefore the third choice offered to the user, is to sum up manually entered numbers, so that once the user chooses this option, we ask for more and more numbers, and we build the sum of those numbers until the user stops that, until the user does not enter any numbers anymore. And we're going to write the logic for all these different options over this course section, of course. Here we're just getting started. And the fourth option which I want to present is that we sum up a list of entered numbers. So here we don't ask for numbers again and again and again. Instead, we ask for a list of numbers separated by a white space, for example, once, and then we'll build the sum of those numbers. And these 4 choices will then later allow me to show you 4 different ways of looping through various values, and you'll see why we need loops to begin with. Now here at the moment we are of course just printing something. Now we want to use the reader to read the user input. So to read a string, and as always, read until that line break character is detected. Now read string returns us that user input, but it actually also returns a second value, which we always omitted up to this point, And that second value, as it turns out, is actually also such an error value, because here already something could go wrong. And hence, we should now also accept this properly and not ignore it anymore, because in general, you should never ignore potential errors, but always handle them. But then here in getUserChoice, I actually won't handle it yet. Instead, I just want to return it along with the actual user input if we have no error, and then handle a potential error in the main function later. Therefore, the only thing I want to do here at the moment is I want to check if error is not equal to nil. But if it is not nil, so if we have an error, I don't want to show an error message yet. Instead, I'll just immediately return so that other code, which I'll add soon, won't execute. And I'll return an empty string because we don't have a user input because something went wrong, and I'll return that error, which is not nil. So I return these two values. I return these two values because I'll also return two values if everything works. And therefore, my getUserChoice function will return two values. The first value will be a string, the second value will be of type error, though of course that could be nil if we have no error, just as I explained it over the last lectures. Now if we have no error, then we get some user input, and then I just want to clean it. I want to get rid of that line break character. So then here in that case, I will use the strings package, which we also saw before already, and use that replace function to replace user input and replace all the line breaks in there with nothing and replace that for all occurrences. And then I got my cleaned user input like that. Now, once we cleaned user input, I want to make sure that it's either 1, 2, 3, or 4, because if it's anything else, then it's also invalid, and then I want to produce and return my own error. Because then it might not be a technical error, but I know that it will be some invalid input for this application which we are writing. Because only the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 entered just as such as plain numbers are acceptable for this application. And we also learned how we can implement that. Here at the bottom, once we got the cleaned user input, I want to check if user input is actually equal to 1 as a string though, not as a number, because we haven't parsed it as a number yet. We are still operating on a string here. And I want to check if user input is equal to 1, or if user input is equal to 2, which is also acceptable, or if user input is equal to 3, which is also okay, or if user input is equal to 4, which is the last value I accept. If either of that's the case, and we can split this across multiple lines, by the way, to improve readability, like that. If either of that is the case, then I know I have a valid user input, and then I want to return user input and nil as an error value, because then I have no error. If we had an error here before, we already returned, so at this point I know that I have no error if I make it in here. However, in the else case, that we have neither 1, 2, 3, or 4 as a value for a user input, in that case I'll return an empty string, because then I have no valid user input in the end, and I want to return an error object. And here I'll build my own error with help of the errors package, which is built into Go, which we need to import though. And on that errors package, we got that new function where we can now add our own error text, invalid input for example, and now we'll return this error if we have an input we can't handle. So now with that, we got our getUserChoice function. In main, I can now call getUserChoice, and I'll get back the selected choice, or however you want to name it, and the potential error we might have gotten. Now, of course, we should handle that error here. And if the error is not nil, so if we have an error, then here I again want to format and print something. I want to say invalid choice exiting, because we are exiting the program now, because I'll then execute return, which, as you learned, ends the function execution. Now, if we make it past this if check, we know that we have no error and we can now work with selected choice. And therefore here, as a last step for this preparation here, we can now check which choice was made and perform different operations for the choice being equal to 1, 2, and so on. So I'll check if selected choice is 1, and if that's the case, I'll execute a certain piece of code. Else, if selected choice is 2, and we're always operating on strings still, that's important, not numbers. So if it's 2, I'll execute some piece of code. Else, if selected choice is equal to 3, we'll execute a certain piece of code. And else, we know it has to be 4. It can't be anything else, because if it would be anything else, we would have created an error here at the bottom. So it can't be anything else. So we know else here means that it's 4. And in that case, I want to execute the code for this fourth option here. And now I'll just add a couple of functions here into which we'll later add the code for those different operations. And the first function will be the calculate sum up to number function. Quite long name, but I want to be clear about what this function does. And we'll add the concrete function code later. The second function will be the calculate factorial function for option number 2. Then we'll have the calculate sum manually function, and we have the calculate list sum function. And now we can just call these functions here. The calculate sum up to number function here in the case that we chose 1, because that is our first program that we want to execute then, that we add all the numbers up to a certain number. So hence we execute calculate sum up to number in that one case. In the second case, we want to build the factorial. So I'll call calculate factorial. In the third scenario, I will actually execute calculate sum manually. And in the fourth scenario, I will then calculate my list sum. And that's now the starting code for the loops feature into which I want to dive. I found it quite interesting to write this together since it allows us to practice what we learned. And therefore, I think it is interesting to write this together before we do now explore that loops feature. And here I'm just getting some yellow squiggly lines that I should remove that punctuation. And that this should be capitalized, invalid input, like this. That's just some general pattern you want to follow. So of course we want to do that here as well, so that we have more like an error code here instead of a concrete error message, which makes sense since we do write our own error message here anyways. And we could then just use this error code to show different messages based on different codes. But that's not something we gotta do here. So therefore, let's now move on and explore loops.